Hi, John.
Hi, Bob. Pleasure to meet you.
Good to meet you. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, publisher of the Nonzero newsletter. This is the Nonzero podcast. You are John Vervaeke. Among other things, the producer of a 50-part video series on YouTube called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, which has gotten a lot of attention. You were recently on the Lex Friedman podcast, very high-profile venue. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And you are now you're at the University of Toronto, and you are you call yourself a cognitive scientist. I gather your background is largely in philosophy.
Philosophy and psychology. Yes.
Okay. So I want to talk about this meaning thing. I think, a lot of people will recognize the problem you're talking about, or at least are familiar with some of the indices you cite of the crisis, higher suicide rate among young people. There are various signs of, more mass shootings and so on. You note that more and more people seem to need to look for meaning in things like video games, virtual worlds. I want to get to the question of whether that's kind of inherently a bad thing or people can find meaning there. But anyway, there are a lot of things you would cite as evidence of the meaning crisis. Just quickly, are there a couple of big ones you'd add to that? What are the on your list? What are the next two or three?
You also get significant surveys. There was one done in the UK in 2019. 89% of people said that they felt their lives were meaningless, which is significant. You get increased loneliness. The number of close friends that people have on average is declining consistently, even though we're more connected virtually. The fact that we seem to be in weird paradoxical states where everything is politicized, yet we all feel disenfranchised and with the political system feel that it's largely not legitimate. And so you've got this weird, you've got polarization and gridlock, but political intensification of everything. That's just one example of all these weird paradoxical things we're in that seems to bespeak a system that's in criticality, that's breaking down in some important ways for people. I think we should note, it's not just negative symptoms like that. This is work I've done with Christopher Mastropietro. There's also positive things in which people are attempting to respond to these. I have criticisms of each one of these, but I do think they should be seen as positive responses rather than sort of symptomatic reactions. Things like the mindfulness revolution, I'm very aware, and I participated in the criticism of that with mindfulness. But the revival of things like Stoicism, growing rapidly, both in terms of the books and the groups and the gatherings, and the fact that meaning and wisdom are now hot academic topics, meaning in life and wisdom. I published on them, and they weren't that even 10 years ago, I think is also a significant sign.
So your growing prominence is evidence of the meaning crisis.
Not just mine, but...
so it has its upsides, so you're right.
Yeah.
So I'd like to... Now my sense, and I do not claim to be conversant in all 50 volumes of your video production or your worldview entirely. It's you have a kind of elaborate diagnosis, and you have a kind of prescription, but it's not like a one true way prescription. It's more like whatever system of meaning you find, it's going to have to accomplish these things. You're kind of providing a checklist. So yes. The way I would like to start this is rather than describe that per se, or the diagnosis per se, I'd like you to tell us where you find meaning, the ways you solve the problem, and if possible, kind of relate that to the checklist. In other words, I find meaning here, and here is kind of the thing on my meaning system checklist that this checks off, if that's not too simplistic a way to put it, if you know what I mean.
No, that's a very interesting framing of it. Well, I mean, in one sense, I don't like some of the connotations of this, but I do practice what I preach. I do have an ecology of practices that I do every day. I have I do a meditative practice, a contemplative practice. I do a mindful moving practice, combinations of Tai Chi Chuan, and Zhen Zhang. I've been doing these for 3 decades.
Just out of curiosity, how long does that take each day? The whole thing?
Usually it takes about an hour and a half.
Okay.
But on some day, I also have a short routine I do when I'm crunched for time, and I can do that in 45 minutes. So I have some flexibility around that.
Okay.
And so, and I won't go through the whole list, but what they're designed to do is address a lot of the things that I talk about. They're trying to give me practices that help me deal with self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior, practices that increase my capacity to connect to myself, to other people, to the world, to get into the flow state as one example of that kind of enhanced connectedness, but also get into it in a way that transfers to other domains of my life. I have dialogical practices that I do with other people.
What does that mean?
So there's practices that like circling practices, a practice that I teach called dialectic into dialogos, which are ways in which people are communicating with each other, not just simply to share information, but to enhance the sense of mutual connectedness so that they both start to experience insight. They both get a sense of opening up within and without. I can get more specific, but and sometimes that's done with other people. Sometimes it's done with other people and a philosophical text in order to get people into a transformative way of reading.
Okay, and what problem is that solving, or what kind of specific void is that filling that for some people remains unfilled?
So a lot of the, multiple. I mean, the one thing is it's overcoming those self-deceptive, self-destructive tendencies in our cognition that need to be addressed in, I think, a with an ecology of practices. I don't think there's any panacea practice. Mm-hmm. It's also enhancing the connectedness, that sense of connectedness mm-hmm. that's at the core if you do work on meaning in life. It's that sense of connectedness to yourself, to other people in the world. Many people, when they're in these practices, we just ran a workshop a couple of weekends ago, myself and Guy Senstock and Christopher Mastropietro, when we took people through a sequence of practices, and they keep saying things like, I didn't know this kind of intimacy was possible. That's how they try to...
It's a structured dialogue of sorts where, I mean, what's the kind of thing that would happen in this dialogue? That like, an exchange that I would, be in awe of, or something that would open my eyes to something.
So what happens is, in one practice, for example, people will decide, they'll be in groups of 4 and they'll decide on a particular virtue. And what they'll do is you'll start with the first person, and they will propose. They don't state third person, they state first person. I propose that honesty is, and then they try to make a proposal. The other person does 2 things. They first of all reflect back to them, making sure, am I understanding you correctly? And then they also try to draw them out. They'll say things like, you were circling your hand when you were doing that. What was going on when you were circling your hand? Can you go back and try and get access? What was happening in addition to the verbal stuff? What was going on when you were doing this? There was that part I didn't quite get. Could you go back and clarify? So they're trying to draw the person out more and more and more and more and more. And then what happens is they then will take up, there's more of a structure, but they'll then take up that proposal, and then they'll turn to another person and they will sort of jazz on it. They will say, I had some concerns. There were things missing in the previous proposal. Here's what I really liked about it. Here's what was missing. I proposed to you, and then they pick it up, and then they do that same cycle. And you circle all 4 people.
Is this, among other things, a kind of a values clarification thing? I mean, people are positing certain values and virtues as being important, and then there's a dialogue. It's a little bit like a seminar.
There's a dialogue, but the point is to get people out of just a conceptual relationship. That's not being ignored, but it's to get people aware of, procedural knowing, perspectival, participatory. That's why virtues are chosen, because they involve beliefs and skills and perspectives and traits.
Let me ask you just before we proceed, if this happens to touch on a hobby horse of mine, which is kind of, cognitive empathy or perspective taking, just understanding the other person's perspective, that's my own nomination for cure-all to, as if I could change one thing in the world to solve as many of the world's problems as possible, it would be to make people better at understanding what's going on in the minds of everyone, friends, enemies, frenemies, everyone. And it's not to be confused with emotional empathy, which is like feeling their pain, although the two may be related and interact. But just perspective taking. Is that an important part of this exercise?
Very much so. I mean, I participated with Igor Grossman and a host of sort of the current research, most of the current researchers doing work on wisdom today, and that meta-perspectival ability is a crucial feature of wisdom, especially as it helps people overcome their own bias, egocentrism, etc. But it is that empathy, but it's also eduction, right? You're not only
what's that word? What?
Eduction, to draw out. You're also helping the person become more. So you're not just empathizing with them. You're being something like a mindfulness mirror. You're reflecting back to them so they can also see more deeply into themselves. And then that enhances your ability to empathetically pick up on them, and you can draw them out more, and you get this sort of shared flow state going.
Hey, here's a crazy idea. Is it possible for you to just like do this with me right now? Like say something you would say in a setting like this to try to get me to understand myself better or something? I'd love to understand myself.
Well, I mean, we can try. I mean, we generally.
It depends on how crazy you think it is. I mean, if nothing else, it might give people an idea of what we're talking about. I doubt we'll see a miraculous transformation. Because I've been trying for a long time. It seems hard, but but if you want to, go ahead, have at me.
Well, no, the thing is, I want you to, it needs to start with you, and you need to take a first-person stance and propose something. Like, so what is it you want to bring into a proposal?
How about the thing I just said, that the key to solving the world's problems is to make people better at understanding how other people see the world?
Right. And so when you're saying that, you're holding yourself like this.
I've been holding myself like this the whole time, so I think that's like not a very valuable variable.
Okay, but why not?
Because I think if it says anything, I think it says two things. One is you can't see it, but I'm not on a chair. Okay,
I see.
I'm on one of these kneeling things. That could be related. There's also the fact that I think the fact that I've been doing this for much of the conversation says that if it says anything, if this posture says anything, it's not saying anything about the proposition I just put forth, but about how I feel when I have these conversations online. It could say something about that.
Right. And you just broke it. And that's what I wanted to happen. You opened up and you did this.
Right. And what do you think? And what do you think that means? I mean, I was trying to make a point emphatically,
yes.
and people do that. But
is that exemplifying the very thing you're after?
Is that exemplifying perspective taking? I doubt it. I mean, I think it exemplifies, there are.
What is it you wanted to get from me when you did that?
I think I wanted to emphasize a point. If anything, my speculation would be, I mean, sometimes you're talking and you realize you're using your hands. Or you go back and you look at a video of yourself and you realize, well, you used your hands here. And usually that signifies to some degree the intensity of your feeling about what you're saying, or how much you want to get it across. Like I'm holding, I'm holding my fist. Look, this is interesting.
Yeah.
It's an exercise I've never done, and I love to think about myself. So, it's also interesting as a study in. I mean, I was actually looking at your video, and I was thinking, well, these videos are doing well, and you use your hands a lot. Okay, so you bring energy to your message.
Yes.
And that's good. But now we're veering onto another subject. And it might be that what I'm actually doing here is trying to change the subject because we're so close to hitting home about some like deeply sensitive aspect of my psyche. That could be what's going on.
Well, I don't want to push it if you don't want to, but
push anything. I'm totally transparent. I'm like, there's already so much damning information about me in my conversations on the internet. The last thing we need to do is worry about lowering people's opinion of me.
So what do you think about that you've become very gestural now, and that's really cool, and you're picking up, and it sort of led to a bit of self-intensification. Do you think that might play any role in enhancing cognitive empathy, bringing in the extra dimensions of communication between people?
Interesting question. I mean, my own view, it's funny. I just last night published a thing in the Nonzero newsletter about Putin and Hitler. And like, is there a danger if you try to put yourself in their shoes and exercise cognitive empathy, wind up sympathizing with them and their cause? Okay. Mm-hmm. And separately but relatedly, there's a guy who did a Twitter thread on me complaining that I don't know enough about Russia to keep trying to figure out what's going on in Putin's head. Or I don't know enough about Putin. I don't have enough information. And my reply to that is going to be, if I ever get around to replying, I think the main impediments to cognitive empathy usually are not a lack of information per se, or at least that's not the first problem. They are emotional. They are about your attitude toward the person.
Right.
You know what I mean? I mean, it's like, and there are famous cognitive biases that I think are relevant, like attribution error.
Yes.
Like how we naturally think about the motivation of enemies as opposed to allies. And in both cases, they can cloud your view of what's really going on in their head. Same with your kids. It's like you're very sympathetic, maybe too sympathetic to understand what's going on in their head and so on. So my view is that the main impediment to cognitive empathy, the first impediment is emotion. Now, overcoming that can open you to more information. You want more information, but it's not like an expertise problem. I think in the first instance, like if we're having trouble understanding why Putin invaded Ukraine, I don't think it's an expertise problem. Okay. That first and foremost. Anyway, that's a roundabout way. I'm just giving you my view.
Yes.
On things. And I know you're noting that I just put my hand on my chest because I was saying like my view, right? Yes. It's I don't know. What do you make of all this?
Well, just what suddenly happened there was a tremendous flow, and you really started, and then you became very involved. And I asked you now to imagine two people doing that more and more in sync with each other, and you can get into a very powerful sense of connectedness. But you do it in a place that is structured, and there's two other people watching you, so that you can also try to keep people aware of the way in which they might be trying to bias or skew things. Mm-hmm. And that's a way of giving people something like a martial arts dojo in which they can practice, I think, if I understand you correctly, part of what you're talking about, which is this cognitive empathy. I think they're also practicing developing their own self-awareness and their own cognitive flexibility in conjunction with that. That's the kind of thing that you're doing in these practices.
Okay. Well, that's interesting. And I might, separately like to pursue that with you and learn more about it. So let's get back on so on the larger issue of the crisis of meaning. Let me describe a diagnosis that I think is different from yours.
Sure.
And have you respond.
Sure.
Which is, it's kind of less, it's more pedestrian, you might say. So a lot of people, like, for example, you're probably familiar with the book Bowling Alone, right? It was a big bestseller. Decades ago, this guy, Robert Putnam, came out with, he noticed that there weren't as many bowling leagues as there used to be. And he turned this into more of a metaphor than probably an important index. But the idea was we don't have enough community. We don't get together and do communal things that bring us satisfaction. And I think it's possible to describe a lot of the problem in these, you might say, relatively mundane terms. In other words, you just ask, like, well, what kind of animals are we, right? Like, we were created by natural selection. We have certain needs. We need to eat. We need to, and there's a number of things that if we don't have them, it's certainly including community, a sense of purpose in some sense, right? And a sense that we're appreciated for contributing something, to the world, and ideally important, deep friendships, ideally perhaps an enduring romantic relationship. Anyway, there's this set of what you might call needs. I suppose you could talk about Maslow, whatever. But anyway, these for the most part, you might call them pedestrian in the sense that they're, you don't need to get all mystical and cerebral to think about them. They're just things people need. Now, separate from that, there had traditionally been, of course, religion, and for many people still is. And the way I would put it is that helps with a couple of other things. First of all, reassures you about death, right? That's nice. I know Lex Friedman asked you about this, and you got heavily into to what extent the fear of death motivates people and so on. I share some of what I think is your skepticism about how pervasively and important that factor that is. But that aside, religion also gives people a clear moral foundation. This is what's right. This is what's wrong. We don't need to have a seminar on moral realism and metaethics, seminars which usually leave you unsure as to whether there is an actual, bedrock foundation for any moral system. Here it is. So you don't have to worry about that. It allows you to know for sure whether you're doing good or bad. Great. So I would say, on the one hand, you have these needs that are, fairly straightforward and mundane. On the other hand, you have these things religion has done for people, which for a lot of people, it's no longer doing. So I would kind of divide the problem like that. And I think that's different from what you do. I mean, you talk about Nietzsche, the death of God and that, but your framework isn't exactly that, right?
It overlaps with it. I mean, a lot of the framework is about rejecting the idea of a meaning of life as some sort of metaphysical mandate and pursuing, and this is why the distinction is invoked in psychology, meaning in life, which are some of those dimensions of connectedness that you talked about. We need to be connected to other people, and in a way in which we feel that we matter, that we make a difference to something that has a value and a reality independent of our own egocentric perspectives. This is the main argument by meaning in life is not reducible to morality. It's because it's not just about the reduction of harm or the promotion of well-being, unless you broadly construe it to mean also just this capacity to maintain the well-functioning of your cognitive agency, which I think meaning in life ultimately points to. I think the reason why these motivations are strong for us is precisely because of a couple of main factors. One is the very complex dynamics, and they're not just within the brain, they're between the brain and the world that make us adaptively intelligent. And you invoked it a few minutes ago, make us perennially susceptible to self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior. And many religions have developed ecologies of practices, mindfulness and ritual to get you out of egocentrism, all kinds of other things, confession, a whole myriad. And as you rightly note, I'm not advocating any one of them. I'm talking about their functionality, right? For addressing that self-deceptiveness, for ameliorating our capacity to be trapped in kind of parasitic cognitive processing. And so I think that is a need, and you can talk about variations amongst the religions, but they all have like this important mindfulness component usually when they've been functioning well, etc. I think that's an important function. I don't think that in this sense wisdom is optional for you. I think you need a whole ecologies of practice for helping ameliorate that self-deception and enhance the connectedness. Now, I do think that goes into another important thing, which is social interfacing. Most of our problem solving is not done as individuals. It's done by plugging into the power of collective intelligence, distributed cognition. In fact, that shows up in a bias. People will confuse possessing a book or distributing something on the internet to actually possessing the knowledge, because the interface function is so prominent and important for our cognitive functioning. And I think one of the things that you have to do is do kind of like what we did a few minutes ago. How are we caring for and taking care of that interface function? I think our culture is doing a crappy job of that right now, and it's been doing it for a long time. I think religions used to do that, and I don't know if they do it well anymore. That's part of the critique. So I think in addition to what you said about the mattering and the connectedness, I think religions have also functioned to help us cultivate wisdom, both individually and collectively. And I don't think that is optional for us either. I think we need to do that. Now,
don't forget what you're going to say, but can we drill down a little on the wisdom thing? I mean, I think by wisdom, you don't mean just propositional wisdom like the book of Proverbs, right? So what's an example of someone gaining a wisdom, kind of wisdom they didn't have, or manifesting wisdom, or ideally the way one of these practices that you practice or advocate would even contribut to that.
Excellent. So let's talk about this. And this is a model that has been around for a bit now in the cognitive psychology of wisdom. So think about first just an insight, and let's make it not just purely cognitive to open it up the way you're suggesting. When you say something like, you have that aha moment. I thought she was angry, but she's afraid. I've been misframing this entirely. I have to reframe this, and I'm changing what I find salient and relevant. And we can come back to that. I think that relevance realization is the key function of our cognition. But now think about that's a one-shot insight, but you can also have an insight that is more systematic. And this is the proposal for what goes on, for example, in cognitive development. You have an insight not into just this problem, but there's a whole bunch of problems, and you get an insight that binds them together. And then you get an insight into a kind of problem, a whole system of problems. And it starts to permeate many more domains of your life because of that. And you see children going through this, like overcoming, conservation problems in general. And it doesn't happen like that, like an insight, but it's this cascade.
Conservation problems in the sense of?
So you take a 4-year-old and you count out 5 candies, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh. And you count out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you say, which one do you want? And they pick the bottom row because it's taking up more space. They haven't figured out that many problems require not just one variable, but an interaction of variables. Like all the empty space is empty candy. Sorry, most of the extra space is empty candy space, right? Empty of candy. And so you can get, and that's a qualitative shift. And now they are now enabled not just in gathering more information, but gathering more kinds of information in a profound way. And they have seen through a kind of systemic and systematic illusion that they've been suffering under. And so they see more deeply into reality. And I think that is the fundamental thing I'm talking about when and therapy often tries to bring this about. When it's successful, it tries to get you often have these sets of complaints that are propositionally often accurate. But what's missing is they have not been brought together into a system that you can intervene in a coordinated manner, because the person is lacking the non-propositional knowing. They're lacking the procedural skills. They're lacking the perspective-taking ability. They're lacking the ability of being able to transform their identity. They have to give up identifying with this and identifying with that. And that kind of comprehensive transformation, especially the non-propositional, that affords us seeing through these comprehensive illusions and more deeply into reality, overcoming self-deception in that way, that's what I would call wisdom.
So this is really important to you, the business of self-deception. Like getting a clearer view of the world in many senses is pretty central to your program. And in that, you agree with, I would think, a number of Buddhist thinkers, of all kinds of thinkers. I mean, it sounds like you view the problem very broadly. I mean, for example, so here's a kind of lack of clarity that I think is probably built into us by natural selection. We tend to overestimate the speed of oncoming objects. You can imagine why that would be the case, right? Better safe than sorry. Better to get out of the way, think it's coming faster than it is, than to underestimate the speed. And then there's another kind of problem where, like, I think I'm a better person than I am, right? That's a famous bias. The average person thinks they're morally better than the average person. Well, somebody's wrong, right?
Yes.
And apparently most of us are. And those are two very different kinds of self-deception. Yes. To me, the first kind, which I would think is more like the candy kind you just described, is in a very separate category and not all that important, right? In my mind, like I'm perfectly happy to overestimate the speed of oncoming objects. And in general, the kind of perceptual, the optical illusion type distortions and so on. So, but it almost sounds like you're viewing these things as, in a way, less separate and kind of comprehensively important. In other words, you're like clarification project works on all fronts. Is that right?
It doesn't, I wouldn't want to make a claim for those things that are not cognitively penetrable, like the perceptual illusions. Now, the interesting thing about the candies is they are cognitively penetrable when the right conditions ensue. Do I think that that's similar enough to the kind of problems that human beings face in trying to realize how they're misframing their identity and their life? I think it is using the same kind of cognitive mechanisms, because the empirical data set suggests that what both things are making use of are abilities of cognitive flexibility, restructuring, connecting things that were previously remotely unconnected from each other, et cetera, et cetera. So I would agree with you that I think the persistent, cognitively impenetrable things, I'm not talking about those. Mm-hmm. But the ones that are cognitively penetrable, I think they're important and are grouped together precisely because they are all cognitively penetrable and are systematic in an important way.
And certainly, I gather you'd say that my coming to realize on a day-to-day basis that I'm actually not as good relative to the other average person as I thought I was. My coming to have a more realistic view of my actual virtues, whatever, that's part of wisdom, right?
It is. But think about what that means. It surely means a lot more than asserting with conviction the truth of the proposition you just uttered. Mm-hmm. It requires cultivating skills that enact it. It requires you actually being able to take perspectives that make it reliably salient and important to you. And it requires you actually transforming the very processes by which you identify with yourself. So it involves a lot of non-propositional cultivation. And I think that's key for two reasons. That's properly how wisdom is different from sort of propositional knowing. And those non-propositional processes are also the same processes, I would argue with evidence, that where most of that sense of connectedness is being generated.
But is a way to put that, what you just said, it involves living as if you believed the proposition.
Yes, but let's remember that we even make this distinction between believing that and believing in, and we're trying to capture something there. And believing, believing originally meant giving your heart to. I don't want it to. I agree with you as long as we take away from that the air of sort of mere pretense.
Right.
It's not pretense. It's more like the serious play that a child engages in when they are trying to go through cognitive development.
Yeah. Well, and it's like, I would say, I mean, an example is the way I feel at the end of like a silent meditation retreat, especially if it's gone kind of well. In other words, I don't have to go around thinking, well, you shouldn't judge people on first impression. Hey, you're not more important than everybody else. You're almost just living you're almost feeling as if that's the case. It's almost built into your perception of the world. You know what I mean?
Yes, exactly. To the degree to which it's cognitively penetrable, gets built into your perception of the world. You start to live as, but it's not just the one-sided. I assume that this is your experience too. When I do these aspects of the world that were previously hidden to me also get disclosed to me. And I start to see things and realize things in both senses of the word, become aware, and they become real for me, right? So the world also opens up to me in those states too. So there are now affordances of connectedness that were not available to me before.
Connectedness with other people?
Other people, and even in your environment. When I come out of those, I feel more connected. I see patterns in the natural world, the social world, etc.
Right. And I think some Buddhists might say that that's related to a kind of less strong or sense of self, or a less possessive sense of self. Right. There's a more the self, the borders of the self are a little more permeable.
Exactly. And so, Bob, what I'm suggesting to you is that, and we can argue about whether or not Buddhism's a religion or not, but what I'm suggesting to you is that those kinds of transformative functions are not typically had at going to your bowling league, right? So I agree that you need the community building aspects, but I'm also arguing for this important transformational dimension that religions also have traditionally performed for us.
Right. I mean, as for Buddhism, I would say on the one hand, in Asia, there's a lot of very traditionally religious stuff, belief in deities, prayers, and so on, that in the West, a lot of people, they don't realize how much a part of Buddhism in Asia that is, because we have focused on the philosophical part, the certain kinds of practices that you can think of as secular and so on. I mean, I would say related to that, though, I'm not sure that what you just described has really been central to religion by and large. I mean, I grew up in a very traditionally religious household, Southern Baptist. And it's like, gave you a clear sense of right and wrong, strong incentive to do right, good, because you get to heaven. And of course, I was thinking of this as a child thinks of it, granted, not the most mature theological apprehension available, but also the community. The community, you're with people who share your values, and you come and you do these rituals that, kind of consecrate the relationships and so on. And, it wasn't, I don't know. I mean, good question. I'm just thinking through, to what extent was the wisdom merely propositionally imparted? There are these verses.
Bob, if I could intervene. There's a bias there. I was brought up in the same situation, so I'm not criticizing you uniquely.
Specifically, what situation?
Protestantism, which is scripture over sacrament. I mean, it was born out of a rejection of a lot of the ritual aspects, and I don't think it's representative of most of the history of Christianity, is what I'm saying.
Okay, could be. On the other hand, who knows? It's a complicated subject. I was reflecting on the fact that, I was aware of propositions related to the practices we're describing, such as Jesus saying, don't look at the mote or the speck in the other person's eye. Look at the beam or the log in your own eye. I mean, you're at least as deceived as anybody else. Focus on that. That's your problem. And it had an effect, but it is more propositional in the way it was imparted.
It was, and I agree with that. But I mean, there still was the singing, and there still was a lot of and there's variation even within Protestants. I mean, so if you go to a Pentecostal service, there's much more emphasis on transformative experience, even within a Protestant framework. So there is considerable variation, even with Protestantism.
Okay. So I got you derailed a long time ago. And it was in the course of responding to my characterization of one view of this as, okay, you have these mundane needs, community, and so on. We used to have traditional religion, reassures you about death, gives you a firm moral foundation. How does your view differ from that kind of dichotomous rendering of the problem? Do you have anything else you wanted to add to how your view is different?
No, I mean, I just wanted to do. I wanted to also answer another question you answered.
Okay.
So the main point I'm making is I agree with all the moral education and the community building, but I'm also trying to add this sapiential, transformative aspect to it, and that's why Many religions have a strong mystical tradition within them. Doesn't mean everybody's a mystic in the tradition, but there are mystical traditions within, emphasizing that transformational dimension. And you wanted to say, can you give me an example? Well, I do what I consider a ritual practice involving a lot of this non-propositional stuff. One of them is Tai Chi Chuan, and Tai Chi Chuan gets me into the flow state in a very powerful way. But what was interesting is that other people, before I noticed it in myself, other people were noticing, and they didn't know I was doing Tai Chi. This was when I was in grad school. They came to me and they say, what's going on with you? You're way more balanced in how you argue with people. You're way more flexible. You're way more and I realized that the things I had been practicing in the ritual was not only designed to get me into those states, but to cultivate traits that were transferable to other situations, and started to ameliorate a lot of, well, the self-deceptive and self-destructive behavior I had been engaging in graduate school. You asked me to give you an example of one of my practices and how it did that, and that's an example I'm just giving you.
Okay. Let me ask you about another kind of, I guess, mundane description of the source of a lot of the problem, which is that it seems to me technology is changing the landscape of our existence very fast.
Yes.
Now, for a long time, technology has been moving at some pace, and people have made social adaptations to the change. For example, like 150 years ago, whatever, the Industrial Revolution is moving a lot of Americans from farms into cities. New environment. It's like, whoa, what do I do here? I used to have this clear set of friends. You saw new institutions arise, like the YMCA, and these various things. And ultimately, I don't know, things like, I guess, the Kiwanis Club or the whatever. But you had these kinds of, venues for fellowship that were created. Now, things were moving really slowly compared to today. I mean, we have seen in the last 20 years, I mean, first of all, it was about 20 years ago that the internet, just the World Wide Web became clearly this huge thing. And then you had social media and so on. And I mean, I'm concerned that things just may be moving too fast for adaptation to happen, for us to because social media, it's a bizarre way for a kid in high school. I mean, I saw it with my kids. It's like Facebook hit, and they're in adolescence, and I think they survived okay, but it's this whole new world. We haven't figured out the rules. We're all familiar now with some of the kinds of damage it can do, and now we're moving on to other stuff. It's like, So to what extent is this part of the problem, this sheer velocity of change?
I think it's an accelerant on the meaning crisis, and I've been arguing that. And I think one of the telling failures of the legacy religions, legacy from the Axial Age, is their incapacity to offer any kind of deep and sustained response to this. I'm not saying individuals who have a religious framework aren't doing that, they are. But I don't see Christianity or Islam or Buddhism or Taoism coming up with a concerted and comprehensive response to this complexification problem that we're facing. And I think that is telling in that when you take a look at the nuns, NONESs, the ones who have no, and they're a large demographic and they're the fastest growing demographic, they will probably, it's a probabilistic prediction, but they will probably overtake, people who belong.
And to finish your sentence, they profess no religious affiliation on the surveys.
That's right. But that doesn't mean they're sort of typically what you might call sort of Sam Harris atheists or something like that. By and large, they describe themselves with this very nebulous spiritual but not religious, in which and they're seekers, which means, and if you ask them, why aren't you taking up one of the legacy religions? You don't get typically, you'll get occasionally, but typically you do not get, well, I have a problem with God and the existence of evil, or I have this. No, they don't invoke standards of truth. They invoke standards of relevance. They say, it's just not relevant. It doesn't live for me. I don't get anything when I'm there, right? Because they have, by and large, not gone through some kind of fundamental restructuring to address the challenges that are now most pertinent in many people's lives. But that doesn't mean that wisdom has become non-optional for these people. They are still engaging in all kinds of practices, sometimes really autodidactic messes, but they are trying to get that transformative dimension activated in their life. And they're willing to risk that and all the mistakes possible therein, because they find the legacy religions are not making themselves like when James talks about something being like a vital option that really can grab you and draw you in.
This
and
is William James, right?
Yeah, William James, exactly. That's the telling thing. So I totally agree with what you're saying. I think it's an accelerant, but I think there's two sides in which it's an accelerant. One is the active side, right, in which it is precisely performing a challenge to our evolvability. Mm-hmm. But it's also a reactive side in that the legacy religions are not stepping up to help people address this concern.
Yeah, and I guess one question is whether the solutions will emerge from just wholly new sources and or not. And well, it looks like you wanted to say something to that.
Well, because I'm doing a lot of right. Again, I try to put my mouth where I try to put my action where my mouth is. I am doing a lot of participant observation. I'm going into these new emerging communities with new ecologies of practices in which people are putting together various practices to try and address what we're talking about. And I'm participating in them. I'm doing pilot studies. I'm asking questions. I'm trying to do the anthropological thing of going through the transformation. I'm trying to answer that question you just posed to me in the most responsible way I think I can. I'm looking, I'm participating, I'm reflecting on it. Because, are we seeing the birth of some new thing that's sort of like a religion, but not a religion? That's what I sometimes call it as a placeholder, the religion that's not a religion. And I do think it's reasonable to say right now that something like that is emerging and coalescing.
Now, it's interesting you said the religion. You didn't say, are we seeing the emergence of a lot of different things that'll work for different people? I mean, do you sense the possibility of a kind of a unifying as well as unified spiritual worldview?
I see it more like the pluralism that you referred when you were talking about how I don't say there's the way. There's something more like a meta curriculum. In fact, I was in Vermont in August meeting with many of the leaders of these emerging communities for the expressed attempt to try to put together a meta curriculum. Not this is the one way, but here are design principles for any good ecology of practices. Here's vetting principles, how we can guard and check on each other so no one community falls prey to the guru. Like all of that is happening. I'm participating in it. That doesn't mean that there's a teleology in it. It's necessarily going to happen, but I think there's a real possibility here for that kind of pluralistic meta curriculum for how to cultivate an ecology of practices within a community, and how those communities to constellate together into a community of communities. That's a real possibility right now.
Okay. Is it possible to identify some contemporary movements that would feed kind of most directly into that? If you know what I mean? It does it draw heavily on mindfulness? Is it related to the so-called sense-making community, which I don't really understand clearly? But I think you've maybe you have a little bit of a connection to that. Or I mean, I know you were. I think you were. David Fuller did a thing with you. Is that right? Maybe I'm wrong. I thought. What's the interview? You know, the Decoding the Gurus guys did a thing on a conversation with you and somebody else that I thought was mediated. But I thought was mediated by David Fuller, but maybe I got it wrong. So anyway, and actually, there's a question raised in the course of that I may get to. But go ahead and you understand what the question is? Is it okay? So what's the answer?
So the answer is what's going on is both a desire and a momentum towards making those connections. I was just at a conference in Thunder Bay called the Consciousness and Conscience Conference, and there's a lot of this coming together. People from these various communities.
So I guess what are the main communities is part of my question.
So there's a lot. There are communities around mindfulness, but there's also communities around but they overlap. There's mindfulness movement, but particularly mindful movement. And so those communities are talking more and more to each other. There's overlap with people coming out of the rationalist community wanting to increase and improve. The people like that were there. People like were there when I went and did Rafe Kelly's Return to the Source. So you have people coming in from hardcore, but wanting to take it deeper into the cultivation of wisdom, people coming out of the rationalist community and wanting to get more embodied, and they're meeting together at Rafe Kelly's Return to the Source, and they're finding that they have a lot to say to each other. There's the authentic.
Did you say hard? Did you say hardcore? And
parkour.
Oh, and then what is that?
Parkour is a way of moving very rapidly and sort of acrobatically and gymnastically through an environment. And what Rafe Kelly has done, it grew up in an urban environment as a response to people feeling sort of ghettoized, and it sort of helped them open up. But then if you take that and do it in nature, you also get the nature connectedness with the opening up experience. And then you get the cerebellar cortex loop running because you're doing all this, movement. I did it. And man, right, like I don't know how else to describe it, Bob, but the phenomenology is sort of the geometry, the space of your cognition opened up after you've done like a week of that. You just become capable of thinking in sort of a kind of flexibility that you weren't. There's an acceptation process that goes on. And so there's that. There's people, like I said, coming out of the authentic relating movement, all these dialogical practices. There's people coming out of the revival of Stoicism. There's people who are coming out of this renewed interest in non-propositional knowing, especially symbolic knowing. All of that, all of them are coming together in important ways.
Now, this embodied cognition thing is related, right? Which I gather you're big on.
Yes, very big on 4E cognitive science. The idea that cognition is inherently embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended. Yes, very much.
I haven't totally wrapped my mind around that. I mean, it's it makes sense to me. I mean, a practitioner of mindfulness would, at a minimum, be aware of the extent to which feelings are different feelings reside in different parts of your body, and how connected they are to your your thoughts, and how they shape thoughts and respond to thoughts, and all of that. That's part of it.
But there's more. Think about this. So you're in seated meditation, and normally they drop this off a lot of fMRIs, which is really misleading. But when you have more extensive fMRIs and other things, the cerebellum is firing like crazy when people are meditating. Now, why is the cerebellum, which has to do with balance and the coordination of movement, firing when you're absolutely still and you're not doing much? And the proposal, and this is moving towards consensus, by the way, it was radical when I started teaching about this, is the cerebellum has been exapted for sensory motor coordination and navigation into more phenomenological and conceptual navigation. Read Barbara Tversky's book, Mind in Motion, that the machinery that we cultivate and develop for physical navigation gets exapted up as we move around as we navigate conceptual space and phenomenological space. That's why we do this thing that we're doing right now, by the way, the gesturing.
Okay. Quick question related to that decoding the gurus thing before I get back to what I hope will be on track. So there was what they did was they excerpted a conversation of you talking to a guy who wants to take the word demons pretty seriously, but it wasn't so clear whether he meant it metaphorically. Like if I have a drug addiction, you can think of that as a demon. And you can think of it as a demon, but there's a metaphorical way of thinking of it, and there's a literal way of thinking of it. And it raises a question, which is, I think there's an approach to bringing meaning to people's lives that involves resurrecting the terminology of religion, even though it doesn't mean the things it meant in traditional religion. I get a little of this from Jordan Peterson. Even it's like, yes, we can use the word God. And you say, well, what do you mean by God? And it's like, I can't even understand what he says after that. And which is, true of, you could just say liberal theology broadly, but anyway, what? That was one thing. Now, demons, it may just be practically useful in overcoming an addiction to think of it as an animate threat, because humans are designed to deal with animate threats. Maybe there's that. But that aside, what do you think of? Do you know what I mean? This business of kind of resurrecting the language, even though the language no longer means the reassuring things it meant, right? Is that useful? I'm skeptical of that.
It depends. Jonathan is arguing for something between the metaphorical and the literal, which
now that's the demon guy, Jonathan
Pageau. Pageau, good friend of mine. He's arguing for something in between what we typically mean by merely metaphorical and literal, which he calls the symbolic. And the whole idea of the symbolic is that it is pointing to real patterns that are often only accessible through an imaginal way. You said, think about IFS, one of the...
Which stands for?
Internal Family Systems Therapy. I've been through it, participant observation, where what you learn to do is you learn when there's sort of inner conflict, you try and allow the part that you are in conflict. And I have to do this because that's part of what gets called into question by this practice. You are in dialogue with it, and you sort of, you personify it to degree, and you enter into a dialogue with it, and very powerful results can come out of it. Mm-hmm. And so let me try and first argue on Jonathan's behalf. Give me a moment, and then I'll try and then address your question. So, is it becoming a plausible case within, bona fide mainstream cognitive science that there is a collective intelligence shared by distributed cognition that's not just the sum of the individual agents' intelligence? Yes.
This is a result of human intellectual collaboration, or
yes,
like General Motors is a collective intelligence.
Right, but also the idea that there's a synergistic effect. It's not just an additive effect.
Right.
And so you have this collective intelligence, and I've published on this recently. Dan Shappy and we talked about the NASA scientists, right, and moving the rovers around on Mars, and how they form with the rovers this overall system that is actually doing the navigation of the rover and the science. So, is it becoming reasonable that there's a collective agent and a kind of we agency? This is taken very seriously. Is it possible that people had sort of a symbolic sense of this in the past and talked about it in terms of God? Well, that's an old hypothesis. That's Durkheim. Again, that's nothing radical. That people personified this in order to interact with it. Mm-hmm. And there's probably good reasons why personification and narrative actually get your cognition in the right way for tracking very complex dynamical systems. Now, does Jonathan think that they are real beyond all of that? At times I hear him saying no, at times I'm hearing yes, and I'm trying to get clear about that. If you ask me, do I think these demons or angels exist without human beings? I give a very clear no. I do not think they do. But I do not think we are just speaking metaphorically. We are trying to use something to point to something. And I would put it to you that in some sense, that's what this is the Durkheimian proposal. That's what people were doing in the past too. They weren't just fiction, right, that was reassuring. That it also put them into contact with real dynamical systems, real, suprapersonal collective intelligence in a way that was facilitatory for them. And so I don't think it's completely de novo that we're using words like demon and angels to talk about these things. And then is it possible that we're doing something that we always do with the meaning of terms? We're picking up on one dimension that's always been prominent, or always been present, and making it more prominent now. Yeah, and that's a legitimate thing to do. We do that in science. We do that in religion. Now, so the question becomes a very messy, difficult question about how can you tell whether or not we are doing that legitimately or not? And I agree with you. That's a very hard question. And I don't have a clear answer to you other than I keep trying my very best to participate in good faith dialogue with all of these people to see if I can take their perspective. And I don't mean in a pretentious way. I mean in an authentic and respectful way in order to answer that question. And I don't think that groups like Decoding the Gurus understand how much this requires participant observation if you're going to make an actual authentic critique. I'm not accusing you of anything, Bob. I'm just answering your question.
Yeah. No, I'm not a host of Decoding the Gurus. I've been on the show. They've been on my show. I have to say I find the podcast enjoyable, but I take your point that, if you want to understand exactly what you were up to in talking about demons, you need to listen to the whole conversation you were having.
Yeah.
And that's on YouTube, right?
Yes, it is. It is.
I know you got to go in a few minutes, but back to this issue of, the problem is to some extent the velocity of technological change. Now, yeah. I know, as I mentioned, you have said one of the signs that there's a meaning crisis is people kind of searching in things like video games and virtual space for the answer.
Yeah.
And what I want to ask is maybe that's where the answer will have to be found. In other words, maybe there will be authentic and meaningful life in virtual worlds and in video game, especially collaborative video games, where you're interacting with other people and not just killing fake zombies. But to what extent do you think that's going to inevitably, if at all, be part of the solution?
I think I think you're right. It has to be part of it. But I want to point out the continuity as well as you're right to point out the discontinuity. This is new, but there's also continuity. We've always gone into special places where we imaginally, rather than virtually, created these imaginal spaces and these imaginal practices for trying to transform the self. That's what a church is. That's what a mosque is. That's what a temple is. And that's what all the art and all the singing and all of that's doing. So there's continuity there. And this again, the legacy religions not seeing, to my mind, but they could, but they don't seem to be seeing that virtuality could exactly be a continuity with that. It could be a place in which people can cultivate the kinds of transformations they're seeking. Now, one point about that, and then something about how I'm responding to exactly that. Notice that when people are going into these games, they're getting a lot of the things that they're not getting in their life. First of all, video games are wonderful machines for flow induction. They get you into the flow state very powerfully. Mm-hmm. The problem right now is in many ways that's not transfer appropriate flow. So unlike the flow that I got in Tai Chi Chuan, that
was the phrase transfer appropriate?
Yes, transfer appropriate. You want to learn it in a way that transfers to other domains of your life. Okay. Now, that happens for some people, but the reverse also significantly happens. You got the WHO admitting there's such a thing as virtual addiction. I've had students in my courses write about, people get into the flow state within the game that actually impairs them from finding it in their life, and they get into anti-flow depression in their real life. And then the two exacerbate each other. You escape the depression by being in the flow in the game, and then the flow in the game exacerbates the depression in the world, and you can get that. So you have to properly curate this domain in order to make it transfer appropriate. I think that is a very real possibility. What are people getting in these video games? They're getting the flow state. They're getting a normative dimension. They know how to self-transcend. They know how to level up. They get a nomological dimension. They know the rules. They can make sense of it. It's a coherent world. They have a narrative that gives them a sense of directionality, orientation, and purpose that tells you what they're hungry for. But you got to feed it in a way, like the churches and the mosques and the temples used to do, that it doesn't stay in the game, that it transfers out into their life. Now, I'm starting to work with people who are in the process of trying, and I think it's very plausible they're succeeding in making a game that will exactly have those kinds of features and try to onboard people into the cultivation of wisdom and actually eventually joining communities, both online and in real life. So yes, it's there. I think we best pay attention to how it can go wrong in order to get an understanding of how it can go right. Tap into the what was already existing in the legacy religions and try and repurpose that, refunction that within the virtual world. But I think that has got to be part of the answer. Yes.
Okay. So final question probably is about enlightenment.
Yes.
That's a term that comes out of Eastern traditions. I mean, actually, usually the word being translated might be more literally translated as awakening, but in any event, it's a concept. It's an idea that, and it exists, I would say, both in the form of yes, enlightenment is attainable and in the form of this ideal that you know you'll never realize as a practical matter, but you understand what you're moving toward, which is more the way I think of it. But
Yes.
do you take the idea of enlightenment in any sense, whether the traditional sense or the traditional senses, or in some new kind of synthetic sense that you've developed or anything? Is that a concept for you, enlightenment?
It is, in that I do think there's a possibility of, profound, well, what I was talking about earlier, something like a very comprehensive, systematic and systemic insight transformation. I studied those transformative experiences, those awakening experiences. But in the series, I explicitly say, let's not over-focus on that. I propose that we should reverse engineer enlightenment. I'm a cognitive scientist. We do reverse engineering. What are the perennial problems that beset human beings? And I say what we need to understand is enlightenment has to be that that state and trait and self and character transformation that reliably and wisely allows people to address the perennial problems facing human beings around self-deception, alienation, absurdity, existential anxiety, getting caught in self-deceptive systems and stuff. Mm-hmm. I propose reverse. If we're going to use the term, I'll even be a little bit more pushy. I don't really care about enlightenment if it doesn't address the perennial problems. So for me, I want to reverse engineer it. I want to use the best cognitive science. What are the interventions? What are the design principles for those interventions that have the best chance of alleviating and ameliorating these perennial problems? And if there is a transformation of consciousness and cognition that helps accelerate that, great. But that's what I want to call enlightenment.
Okay. I knew that wouldn't be quite the last question, but I think this is. You mentioned self-deception again, and I just like to get you to say, if you haven't quite said it yet, like what are the most problematic forms of self-deception? I mentioned earlier two different kinds, more purely perceptual cognitive, and then something more about your kind of moral evaluation of yourself and other people. When you think of self-deception as a big problem, is there a particular form of it that people would recognize as exemplifying the problem?
Yeah, I think the argument that is emerging that most of the rationality biases and most of the social psychological biases, like the attribution error as a social psychological, the confirmation bias as a rational bias, all are grounded in something like the my side bias. Me and my side should be privileged at all times, and that we skew what we find relevant and salient, and we ignore things that tend to challenge that bias. And that what you can then see is, again, I don't think it's too controversial to say many of the legacy religions zero in on that as a focal thing that they are trying to challenge in some profound way.
Mm-hmm. While sometimes manifesting the problems themselves.
Of course.
So you see your work is fundamentally related to the much discussed like political polarization problem, the psychology of tribalism problem, whatever you want to call it.
Yes, I do very much. I think that's another important symptom of the meaning crisis.
Okay. Well, thank you. I mentioned your video series, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. What other forms of your work would you plug, or social media presences or whatever? Where would you send people?
Well, what I would ask people is, take a look at some of the other things on my channel. I do something similar like this. I do Voices with Vervaeke, where I talk to various people.
Your YouTube channel?
YouTube channel,
okay.
Yeah. I also do the Cognitive Science Show, where we have me and a bunch of other cognitive scientists talking about various topics in a dialogical fashion. But most importantly, ask people to keep an eye out for the next big series I'm going to do called After Socrates, which is going to be released the beginning of November.
All right. And you're not on Twitter or anything?
I'm on Twitter. They can follow me on Twitter. Yep. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Facebook. Yes.
Okay, good. All right. Well, thanks for taking the time. I really enjoyed this.
I did too, Bob. It was a great pleasure. Great questions. I really enjoyed the exchange.
Great answers. Thanks.
Thank you.